When people think about the fall of Rome, they imagine barbarians storming the gates, legions collapsing under Gothic swords, or mad emperors poisoned in marble halls. But the greatest empire the world had ever seen didn't die from a single wound. It bled out slowly, poisoned from within, and the weapon wasn't wielded by an enemy general. It was minted by Rome's own emperors. Rome didn't fall because of barbarians. It fell because its money became a lie. And that lie, the idea that you can destroy your currency and escape the consequences, is a blueprint for collapse that still haunts us today. Let's establish what was at stake. For over 4 centuries, Rome's economic power rested on a single object, the silver denarius. First minted around 201 BC, this coin was nearly pure silver, a physical manifestation of Roman dominance. Legionaries earned their pay in it. Merchants from the Germanic forest to the Parthian east demanded it. Farmers hoarded it in clay jars beneath their floors. The denarius wasn't merely currency. It was confidence cast in metal, a promise that Rome's word was as solid as the silver in your hand. The empire and its money were inseparable. As long as people believed in Rome's strength, they believed in the denarius. And as long as they believed in the denarius, Rome had strength. But empire is expensive. By the 2nd century AD, Rome was bleeding gold to defend borders stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia. Over 300,000 legionaries required constant pay. Thousands of miles of roads demanded maintenance. Massive aqueducts, grain subsidies, gladiatorial games. The costs were astronomical. Germanic tribes pressed from the north. Parthian armies threatened the east. Rebellions erupted within. The treasury faced an impossible equation. Expenditures exceeded revenue, and the gap was widening. The emperors had 2 choices: raise taxes, always politically dangerous, often fatal to those who tried, or employ an age-old deception, debasement. Reduce the silver content of the denarius, mint more coins from the same amount of metal, and hope no one notices the difference. The numbers tell the story of a slow-motion betrayal. Under Emperor Augustus, at the dawn of the empire's golden age, the denarius contained approximately 95% pure silver, a coin you could trust with your life savings. But over the following centuries, each generation of emperors took a little more, replaced a little more silver with cheaper bronze, convinced themselves the lie could hold. By the time the crisis of the 3rd century arrived, that lie had consumed the empire from within. Before we dive deeper into how Rome's currency collapse destroyed an empire, hit that subscribe button. This is a story that connects directly to what's happening in our economy right now, and you won't want to miss what comes next. Also, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I want to see how global this audience really is. Now, let's continue. By the time the crisis of the 3rd century arrived, that lie had consumed the empire from within. But the lie didn't start as a catastrophe. It began as a whisper in the treasury, a small compromise that seemed almost reasonable. To understand how Rome destroyed itself, you need to picture the world the denarius built. In 201 BC, when the first silver denarii clinked into soldiers' hands after the Second Punic War, Rome was still a regional power drunk on its victory over Carthage. The coin was simple, stamped with the goddess Roma on one side, the Dioscuri twins on the other. Nearly 95% pure silver. Substantial. Real. You could bite it and feel the soft give of genuine metal. Within a generation, that coin had traveled further than any Roman legion. Germanic chieftains hoarded them as symbols of prestige. Egyptian merchants weighed them on scales in Alexandria. Syrian traders passed them hand to hand in the markets of Antioch. The denarius became the dollar of the ancient world, universally recognized, universally trusted. This wasn't accidental. Rome understood something fundamental. Money is belief made physical. Every time a merchant accepted a denarius for grain, every time a soldier trusted his wages would hold their value, they were voting for the empire's legitimacy. The coin was Rome's promise that its power would endure, that its silver would remain silver, that tomorrow would look like today. For centuries, that promise held. But maintaining an empire isn't like ruling a city-state. Pax Romana, the Roman peace, came with a price tag that would bankrupt kingdoms. Over 300,000 legionaries stood guard along borders stretching 10,000 miles, from Hadrian's Wall in the fog-shrouded north to the sun-scorched sands of Mesopotamia. Each soldier required not just wages, but equipment, food, and the infrastructure to support him. Roads had to be built and maintained, over 250,000 miles of them, connecting every corner of the empire. Aqueducts carried water into cities where millions demanded bread and spectacle. The grain dole alone consumed fortunes. The empire had become a machine that required constant feeding, and it was slowly eating itself. By the mid-2nd century AD, the mathematics had turned brutal. Imperial expenses exceeded revenues by staggering margins. Wars on multiple fronts drained resources faster than tax collectors could replenish them. The treasury faced a choice that would echo through history. The honest path was clear but politically suicidal. Raise taxes. Tell citizens they must pay more to sustain the empire's glory. Several emperors who tried that approach didn't live to see the next year. So they chose the other path. In the imperial mint, the formula changed. Not dramatically. That would cause panic. Just slightly. Reduce the silver content from 95% to 90%. Add more copper to the mix. Mint more coins from the same amount of precious metal. The coins looked the same. They bore the emperor's face with the same authority. But they were no longer what they claimed to be. The first batches passed unnoticed. Markets absorbed them. Life continued. But in that moment, that first decision to make the money a lie, Rome had crossed a threshold. The emperors had discovered a drug more addictive than any opiate, the ability to create wealth out of deception. Each successor would take a larger dose. The silver content dropped to 80%, then 70%, then 50%. The treasury had learned it could print its way out of any crisis. What it didn't understand was that it was printing its way toward oblivion. The treasury had learned it could print its way out of any crisis. What it didn't understand was that it was printing its way toward oblivion. The descent, once begun, accelerated with terrifying momentum. Under Emperor Caracalla in the early 3rd century AD, the denarius crossed a psychological threshold. It fell to roughly 50% silver. Half the coin was now base metal. Half was lie. But Caracalla needed funds for his military campaigns and lavish bonuses to buy loyalty from increasingly restless legions. The silver bled away into bronze. Then came Gallienus, ruling during the empire's darkest hour in the 260s AD. Under his reign, the denarius dropped below 5% silver content. The coin that had once been Rome's promise had become Rome's most elaborate fraud. A bronze disc with a silver wash so thin it rubbed off between fingers. The imperial mint had become a counterfeiting operation, and every citizen held the evidence in their palms. You could see the transformation if you knew where to look. Hold an old Augustan denarius next to a new one. The weight told the first story. The ancient coin sat heavy and substantial in your hand, while the modern one felt suspiciously light, almost hollow. The color had shifted from the bright, clean gleam of pure silver to a duller, reddish tint where the bronze showed through. Scratch the surface, and the silver coating flaked away like cheap paint. Marcus, a grain merchant in Rome, noticed it first in his strongbox. He'd been saving denarii for 30 years, planning to buy a small farm in the countryside for his retirement. Each week, he'd added coins to his hoard, watching his future take physical form. But by the 260s, when he compared his oldest coins to the newest ones, the betrayal became visceral. His life's work was evaporating. The coins he'd earned decades ago were still valuable. They contained real silver. But the recent wages? They were tokens, promises written on metal that had no intrinsic worth. He began weighing every coin he received. Other merchants did the same. Old silver commanded premiums. New silver was traded at discounts or refused entirely. The market responded with brutal honesty. A modius of wheat that cost 1 denarius in the year 200 AD cost 50 denarii by the 260s. Then 100. Then 500. The wheat hadn't changed. The harvests were normal. But the money had become worthless, so it took mountains of it to purchase anything real. Farmers watched their calculations collapse. They planted crops, paid laborers, stored grain, all on the assumption that money would hold some relationship to value. But by harvest time, the coins they'd receive would buy half what they'd been worth at planting. Why bother growing surplus for market when the payment was a lie? Tax collectors arrived at estates demanding payment in the new debased currency. Landowners handed over cartloads of the bronze core coins and watched officials' faces darken with rage. Everyone understood the game now. The state was paying in garbage and demanding value in return. Local economies began to fracture. In provinces far from Rome, merchants reverted to barter. Wheat for olive oil, wine for tools, actual goods for actual goods, because the imperial currency had become a cruel joke. Even soldiers, supposedly the regime's most loyal supporters, began refusing their wages unless they included payment in kind, food, land grants, anything but the debased coins. The denarius still circulated, still bore the emperor's face, but it no longer represented Rome's promise. It represented Rome's desperation, stamped in worthless metal. The denarius still circulated, still bore the emperor's face, but it no longer represented Rome's promise. It represented Rome's desperation, stamped in worthless metal. What followed was 50 years of civilizational unraveling. Between 235 and 284 AD, Rome entered what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, a period so chaotic it seemed designed to prove that monetary collapse breeds every other form of collapse. 26 emperors claimed the throne. Most died violently, murdered by their own soldiers or rival claimants. Germanic tribes poured across the Rhine. Persian armies conquered Roman territories in the east. Plague swept through cities already weakened by economic devastation. But these weren't separate catastrophes. They were symptoms of the same disease, a broken financial system that had destroyed the state's ability to function. Legions mutinied because their wages were worthless. Border defenses crumbled because no one would accept payment to man them. The empire's famous roads fell into disrepair because there was no money, no real money, to maintain them. Emperor Diocletian, ascending to power in 284 AD, looked at this wreckage and made a decision that seemed logical on the surface. If the money was broken, if prices were spiraling out of control, then simply fix the prices by law. In 301 AD, he issued the edict on maximum prices, one of history's most ambitious attempts to legislate economic reality. The edict covered over 1,000 goods and services, from wheat and wine to legal fees and teachers' wages. Each item received a maximum price, carefully calculated and carved into stone monuments erected throughout the empire. The punishment for violation was death. Diocletian believed he could command the market to obey. The market had other plans. Within weeks, a perverse tension gripped Roman society. Merchants faced an impossible choice: sell goods at the legal price using worthless coins and go bankrupt, or violate the edict and risk execution. Many simply stopped selling altogether. Goods vanished from official markets. Shops closed. Farmers hoarded their harvests rather than sell wheat for coins that couldn't purchase next season's seed. But human beings still needed to eat. And so the black market exploded. In dark alleys and private homes, real trade continued, but now at prices far exceeding even the hyperinflated levels that had prompted the edict. A modius of wheat might be fixed at 6 denarii by law, but in the shadows it traded for 50, 100, or simply for other goods. The law had made honest commerce illegal, so commerce became dishonest. Officials faced their own crisis. Tax collectors still demanded payment, but what they collected was worthless. Landowners abandoned estates rather than pay taxes in debased currency for land that produced real value. The empire's famous network of agricultural production began to fragment into isolated, self-sufficient domains, the seeds of medieval feudalism. Constantine the Great, recognizing the terminal state of the denarius, introduced a new coin in 312 AD, the gold solidus. Nearly pure gold, carefully weighted, it was everything the denarius had once been. For a moment, hope flickered. Perhaps a new currency could restore order. But it was too little, too late, and too expensive. Gold solidi became the money of elites and international trade. The masses still circulated the worthless bronze-washed denarii. The empire now operated on two economies, a real one for the wealthy, a phantom one for everyone else. The Western Empire limped forward for another century and a half, but its economic heart had stopped beating. The historical catastrophe wasn't the fall of Rome in 476 AD. It was the moment, decades earlier, when a law tried to make a broken coin whole and failed. You cannot legislate trust. You cannot decree value. Once money becomes a lie, everything built upon it begins to crumble. The historical catastrophe wasn't the fall of Rome in 476 AD. It was the moment, decades earlier, when a law tried to make a broken coin whole and failed. You cannot legislate trust. You cannot decree value. Once money becomes a lie, everything built upon it begins to crumble. The Romans weren't the last to learn this lesson. They were just the first to document it so thoroughly. Fast forward to Weimar Germany, 1923. The echoes are deafening. The German government, crushed by war reparations and unable to raise taxes, turned to the printing press. Within months, the Reichsmark became toilet paper with official stamps. A loaf of bread that cost 250 marks in January cost 200 billion marks by November. Workers collected wages in wheelbarrows, not because they were rich, but because it took that much paper to buy a day's worth of food. Life savings evaporated overnight. The middle class was destroyed, and in that destruction, the seeds of extremism found fertile ground. Zimbabwe, 2008, provided a more recent demonstration. The government printed currency to fund its operations, and hyperinflation consumed the nation like wildfire. Prices doubled every single day. The central bank issued a $100 trillion note, a piece of paper that couldn't buy a loaf of bread. Eventually, Zimbabwe simply abandoned its own currency. Merchants demanded US dollars, South African rand, anything except the official money that had become a punchline. But the most significant echo arrived quietly on August 15, 1971. President Richard Nixon announced the US dollar would no longer be convertible to gold. The Bretton Woods system, which had anchored global currencies to something real since World War II, was severed. For the first time in history, the world's reserve currency became purely fiat money. Money by decree. Money because the government said so. Sound familiar? It's the silver wash in modern form. Instead of coating bronze coins with a thin layer of silver, modern governments print paper in digits backed by nothing but promises. The mechanism has evolved, but the fundamental deception remains identical. Here's why this time is more dangerous. Rome was an empire. When its currency collapsed, the damage was regional, contained within its borders. Today, the dollar underpins the entire global financial system. Trillions in debt, derivatives, and digital promises stack upon a foundation of fiat currency. When, not if, but when, that foundation cracks, the consequences won't be limited to one empire. They'll be planetary. Look again at that image of the split coin, half ancient Roman denarius, half modern currency, both melting into ruins. The fracture running through it isn't decorative. It's diagnostic. The real killer wasn't the barbarians at Rome's gates. It was the officials in Rome's treasury who believed they could cheat mathematics, who convinced themselves that value was whatever they declared it to be. Every empire that has debased its currency has followed the same trajectory. Slow decline, sudden collapse, and the bewildered question of how it all went so wrong. The pattern repeats because human nature repeats. Governments facing impossible choices will always choose the printing press over the hard truth. But here's what the ancients understood that we've forgotten. Real wealth doesn't exist on a screen or in a government's promise. It exists in land that produces food, skills that create value, resources that have intrinsic worth. The Romans who survived the currency collapse were those who owned farms, not coin hoards. The Weimar Germans who endured were those with tangible assets, not bank accounts. History doesn't repeat exactly, but it rhymes with devastating precision. And if you don't understand a rhythm, if you ignore the ghost of the Denarius as it whispers its warnings, then you're standing exactly where countless others stood before the ground gave way beneath them. The question isn't whether our current monetary system will fail. The question is whether you'll recognize the signs before it's too late.